Welcome to episode number 1 of Manuscripting Pod, a show where I talk about writing, explore procrastination, and attempt to keep my own inner critic hogtied and in the corner. I'm your host Les, and in this episode, I'm introducing the podcast to the whole big wide podcasting world. So, like I said, welcome. In this show, the setup is still up in the air, but I'm planning on talking about some of the things that I'm excited about. I'll have a main topic, and then if there are any questions, I'll answer those. I want to put the spotlight on something that I'm really enjoying, and then thanks and shoutouts and all of that fun stuff. So, let me get started by telling you some of the things that I'm finding exciting in the world of writing recently. For me, part of writing is reading, and I read a lot. And I divide my reading up into sort of 2 sections. Part I read for educational purposes, and then I also read just for entertainment. And some of the stuff that I read after work, I use actually to shift gears out of work mode and into relaxation mode. So lately I've been focused on reading a lot of lesfic. And lesfic, for those of you who are not up on that kind of terminology, is a book or fiction novel that focuses on lesbian main characters, and I've been recently taking a really deep dive into romance, which up until recently was not something I read a lot of. So anyway, I just finished reading Monica McCallan's second full-length novel, Back to the Start, which was fabulous, a lot of fun, even though it delved into my least favorite romance trope, which is the second chance romance. It was really well done. The second novel that I finished recently was Lou Bard's debut novel, There's a Possibility. Lou really nailed the debut novel. The story's fabulous. It flows really well. So yeah, you should go and check out both Monica McCallan's and Lou Bard's novels. They're fabulous. For educational purposes, I'm reading Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. It's interesting. I mean, it's the whole idea of using psychedelics as a psychological way of medicating depression and possibly anxiety, though that is still questionable. There hasn't been enough research on it yet. In the same vein, I've been reading Brewer's The Craving Mind, which explores addiction and the accompanying psych responses to addictive behavior. It's classic research-backed CBT, but a really great read nonetheless. It kind of looks at the causes and effects of addictive behavior. So if you're interested in that, I highly suggest you check out The Craving Mind. So in terms of the main topic, this is where the main topic section of the podcast will go. I've already talked about the setup of the show. What I really want to do in this podcast is focus on writing and getting myself psyched up for writing. I've talked on RSVP and on Twitter and other locations about how anxiety and I are old friends. And really part of my reason for not writing has a great deal to do with my own anxiety and other, and as well as depression. That's not going to be a huge focus of this podcast, but I'll go into that a little bit more with the next topic. So I really also want to explore self-publishing in the podcast. I'm looking at my novels and where I think I want to publish. I mean, I've talked on the RSVP episode with Harry Marks about how I would like to be a hybrid author. I would love to be traditionally published, but I also really enjoy the indie and self-publishing world of being in complete and total control of your work. And, I've gone on long tangents in the past about owning your own content and not allowing a corporation to have it. So self-publishing really philosophically is something that I identify with. So going back to that anxiety piece, scheduling is something that I wanted to talk about in this inaugural episode, if you will. I thrive under a schedule. The last 3 years have been really difficult for me. And I would go back to, say, 6 years, because 6 years ago I quit my corporate job. And all of a sudden I had no consistent schedule. From semester to semester, my schedule was different, and then I began interning, and my internship had a regular schedule, but school still did not. So basically for 6 years, my schedule has been, some days I'd be at school until 9 o'clock at night, not getting home until 10. There were times when, up until recently, my work schedule, I was part-time at one place and then also part-time at another in the same location. It's hard to explain. So I was working in a partial hospital program and also at an outpatient clinic. So I would be working 25 hours in the partial program, which was consistent. And then my hours in the outpatient clinic were never consistent. Some days I'd be there until 3:00. And then on other nights, I would be at work until 7:00 and not getting home until 8:00 at night. So having that up and down, up and down, up and down schedule, really, I don't thrive under that. I don't do well with an inconsistent schedule. And a couple of weeks ago, I was finally hired full-time in the partial program. So I'm going to be doing that full-time. And then my outpatient hours, I'll be doing, I'll be at work until 5:00 every night. And then I'll be able to come home and actually do something. I'll be able to schedule some time to work. I'll be able to get up at the same time every day. And that is, I know that's how I thrive. I do really well with a schedule like that. So one of the things I'm really looking closely at is scheduling that time first thing in the morning. So I'm going to be scheduling myself to get up a half hour early. I don't have to get up until 6:30 for my job. So I'll be getting up at 6, and that extra half hour I'm going to use to write. So the other thing that goes into the anxiety portion is when I didn't know what my schedule would be like, I could read relatively easily, but I found sitting down and being creative even more difficult. And then on top of that, I found writing the blog. I've been doing the blog for a long time. Anyone who's here, if you're not aware, I've been blogging since 2002, and blogging was really difficult. Writing reviews was really difficult. Again, part of it is that, my job is stressful. I deal with a lot of difficult things day in and day out. And that keeping a consistent schedule is hard. And then coming home after that and being keyed up and stressed out because of work was also difficult. So it was hard for me to shift gears and be creative after work because I wasn't able to do it. And that feeds into my anxiety a little bit. I'm not able to be creative, which is also self-care. And we'll probably talk a lot about self-care in this podcast. But anyway, I digress on the topic of self-care. So in Nano, I would be able to, crush my Nano goals because it's only a month. And I became really hard on myself after Nano. I mean, I've won Nano a couple of years now. I've never been able to do Camp Nano successfully, which I'm kicking myself for. But anyway, going back to what I was talking about. I would successfully kill Nano. I would crush my goals. I'd be working consistently. And then after Nano, I would be like, why can't you, during November, you can do 1,667 words a day. Why aren't you doing that now? And I would be really, really hard on myself. And my inner critic would just be going wild with, well, you did it during Nano. Why aren't you doing it now? So one of the things that I'm going to be doing is being a little more gentle on myself. And I'm going to use this podcast to kind of keep track of being more gentle to myself. And part of that is in those 30 minutes that I'm scheduling myself to work and work on writing, I'm going to not expect myself to do 1,000 or 1,666 words. My initial goal, there's my dog. My initial goal is only going to be 100 words, which I know I can do. I'll set up a sprint. I'll use my tracking apps and my spreadsheets, which I'll talk a little bit more about that. Using those tools that I use to successfully complete Nano, I'm going to track it and see 100 words. And then I'm going to keep it that. I'm going to see how it works for a month and if I'm able to do the 100 words. And then maybe I'll up it. If I can do 100 words a day, then maybe I can do 200 or 150 or whatever. We'll see how it works out for a month. And then I'll come in and I'll check in. Hopefully I'm going to use this podcast to check in on myself and say, okay, so I did my 100 words every day this week. Although one of the things in terms of being a little more gentle with myself, I'm only going to expect myself to work 5 out of 7 days a week. I'm not going to expect myself to work 7 days a week on the writing. If I have a particularly stressful day at work, I'm going to give myself the slack to the next day not have to do it. However, if I do work, then great. That's fabulous. So, moving into the what I mentioned earlier, tracking apps. I am a huge fan of productivity reading, and I've talked about this on RSVP, so I'm not going to go into it here. Which, if you're not listening to RSVP and you want to hear me blather on about productivity books and whatnot, I am a fan of them. I read a lot of productivity books and websites, and I've listened to podcasts, and I'm done with it now, but it is something that I've enjoyed for a lot of time. So I do use a number of apps to keep track of my productivity and show that I'm working, although I often forget to turn them on. And so one of the apps that I use is Productivity Challenge. And it's kind of a fun little app. It calls you names it's not the worst names, it's not horrible names, but the Productivity Challenge app, it gives you a timer, and it's sort of like the Pomodoro method. I'll link in show notes to Pomodoro so that you know what I'm talking about. And you can set the amount of time you want to work and then the downtime afterwards. And I find it really, really helpful. The other thing that I really find helpful is bullet journaling. I, for a long time, was like, I can't bullet journal. And then what I realized when I did a live video over on the RSVP podcast Facebook group, I realized I've been doing bullet journaling. I just haven't been using their fancy little icons. So I'm going to start using those icons, and having a list where I can check off and cross off what I've been doing has been really, really helpful for me for ages in terms of tracking like what I'm working on for the podcast and all of that fun stuff. So I'm going to be using bullet journal tracking apps. And then I also have a spreadsheet that I created during NaNoWriMo to keep track of my writing during Nano. So that's going to be something that I definitely am going to continue to use. So I think that's it in terms of just kind of giving you an idea of what the podcast is going to sound like, hopefully. Here in this section of the podcast, I'm hoping to have a little question and answer if anyone has any questions, which I'm then going to follow up with a spotlight. So in this section, I want to show some support outside of what is exciting to me and really highlight either a book, a work, podcast, author, or etc. that I think is doing something right, or I find particularly inspiring. I completely stole this idea from the podcast Call Your Girlfriend, and they have a whole show called Shine Theory. They also have there are several articles about it. If you Google Shine Theory and Call Your Girlfriend, you're going to come up with a bunch of different articles. So the idea is basically that you talk about other women and what women are doing and, say positive things about them. So anyway, doing that, Call Your Girlfriend is a podcast. It's great. It's aimed at women. It's two best friends sitting down and talking about a giant variety of topics. The last year's worth of episodes have been phenomenal. They don't need me to put a spotlight on them, but they've given me a huge amount of joy as I listen to them on my commute. So now I just want to give out some thanks. Huge thanks to Jessie, aka Herding Nomad, over on Instagram. He saw me fiddling around with some calligraphy and whatnot as I tried to come up with an idea for the podcast's logo. And he said he wanted to try something in some calligraphy for me. And so if you look at the image with the podcast this week, that's from Jessie, aka Herding Nomad. And, I think that's really cool. So if you want to work on an image, tag hashtag Manuscripting Pod on Instagram, and I'll put it out as the podcast image, and I'll give you a shout out on the show. So moving into shout outs after that, I want to give a shout out to the folks who've already been so supportive of this podcast. I mean, I haven't even published an episode yet, and people have been really cool about it, both in RSVP, on Twitter, and, just in general. Toffer, Jessie, Andy of the Erasable Podcast, Brad on the Pen Addict, Jane on the Manuscripting Pod group, and then my co-hosts over on RSVP, Lenore and Dee. They spent an entire episode of RSVP helping me get over my anxiety about starting this podcast. So that's been really cool. And then talking to Brad really solidified some of the thoughts that I had about this podcast and how I really feel about writing. And, I've had this lifelong love with writing ever since I was, 10 years old. I've been writing things, telling stories to people, and I love writing. And I just really want to continue to tell stories, and that's what this podcast is going to be about. So I also want to thank the Manuscripting Facebook group for tolerating me just randomly changing it over to the Manuscripting Pod group. Little did they know that when I was creating the Manuscripting Facebook group over a year ago, I'd been thinking about creating this podcast. So just a big thanks for tolerating the change and sticking with me. I really appreciate it. I want to give everyone over on Instagram and Twitter a thank you for giving me great feedback as I messed around with watercolors and attempted to do some script and writing or calligraphy by hand to create the logo, and giving me feedback about the colors and the logo. It's been fun. I had a lot of fun messing around with the watercolors and, various pens and ink to create the watercolors behind. I eventually did give up because I know that my talent does not, it's not in writing in script. It's not in calligraphy. I try, but it's just terrible. So anyway, watercolors, are where it's at for me. And then I did find some fabulous fonts to use, for the logo that were free and to use for commercial means. So, thank you for giving me feedback. So in terms of support, if you want to show some support for the show, head on over to your favorite location and leave a review. If you've left a review, or you just don't want to engage with Apple, share your support on your favorite or least favorite social media location. If you want to support me with cash money, which I'll probably spend on more stationery and lots of coffee, head on over to Ko-fi. I think I'm Elsie Harper over there. I'll put a link in the show notes to my Ko-fi page, and you can, give me some money. Feel free to find me on social media at Original Elsie Harper on most locations. You can find the site for the podcast over at manuscriptingpod.com. I'll have links to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and the Manuscripting Pod website in the show notes. I'll also have show notes that list all of the books that I've mentioned and websites and all of that fun stuff. So thank you for listening. I hope that you continue to listen after this rambly show. And I think you can expect most of the shows of me basically talking to myself to be around 15 to 30 minutes long. So thank you for listening. Bye.